Welcome, everybody. Thanks so much for taking time to be here today. I'm really pleased to be here today for Julie and Phil's defense. I just want to say a few words about them. Julie holds a BS in Environmental and Forest Biology from SUNY Environmental School of Science and Forestry. She's worked on aquaculture projects in zoos and done coral reef research. She's also a certified dive master. When starting the master's program, she said that her passion lies around marine environments. I would love to work with a community or communities who are concerned about local issues pertaining to marine conservation through education and local project involvement. Somewhere warm would be a bonus. And when Julie showed up yesterday, she had flip-flops, and only flip-flops. So I think she's doing what she wants to do. She's going to continue collaborating with Blue Ventures in Belize. She leaves tomorrow morning. Phil holds an undergraduate degree in environmental studies from Naropa University. He has worked on numerous conservation projects in the Western U.S. and Canada. Prior to entering the master's program, he worked with the BLM as a botanist. When starting the master's program, Phil said that he would like to make a difference in the way conservation is incorporated into the community of land managers. I imagine he will be doing just that as he starts his job, working as a conservation specialist in the botany program in the Colorado State Office of the BLM. So, thank you so much. It's been such a pleasure working with both of them. I've really enjoyed it.
Were you going to introduce Jen, or do you want me?
And on the line here is Jen Chapman. She is the country coordinator of Blue Ventures, who is our collaborating organization in Belize, and the organization that Julie and Phil have been working closely with over the past several months.
Yeah.
Okay, thanks. Take it away.
Thanks, everybody, for showing up this afternoon. We are students in the Warner College of Natural Resources and the Conservation Leadership Through Learning program. And our capstone project was the assessment of the feasibility of human consumption as a management strategy for the invasive lionfish in Belize. So as a quick overview of our presentation today, we're going to give an introduction and sort of put into context what our project was about. We're going to give a couple case studies of some of the case studies we found in our literature review that are associated with our topic. We'll discuss a little theory behind the adoption of a new idea, in our case, consuming lionfish. And then we'll talk about our methods, our results. We'll give some discussion about what that all means and some recommendations for Blue Ventures moving forward. So our project was developed because of a regional strategy between the Mesoamerican Reef Fund and Blue Ventures. Blue Ventures is a non-governmental organization that has been working towards developing both domestic and international markets of lionfish since 2011. And so the strategy involved trying to understand if consuming lionfish through exploitation was even a viable management strategy. So with Phil and our background of social science, we were able to go in and assess Belizean attitudes towards consuming lionfish. So just a quick introduction of where Belize is. It is the second smallest country in Central America. It is bordered by Mexico to the north, Guatemala to the west and south, and then the Caribbean Sea to the east. Along Belize's coastline, we have the Mesoamerican Great Barrier Reef. You can see the iconic blue hole, the Caribbean Sea out to the east, and it is designated a UNESCO World Heritage Site. So the invasion itself, lionfish are actually from the Indo-Pacific. They are a very popular aquarium trade species, especially here in the U.S., and that is thought to be the vector of introduction. They were reported off of the coast of Florida in the mid-1980s, either through introduction from Aquarius or through hurricanes, which are very prevalent in the area. And since that time, they have expanded into the Western Atlantic, through the Gulf of Mexico, and then throughout the greater Caribbean region. In Belize, they were first recorded in 2008 at Turnip Atoll, and since then, the recordings have just keep expanding throughout all of Belize. So some of the reasons why lionfish have been really successful at invading is, number one, they're generalist carnivores. They will consume any small fish, typically juvenile fish, and invertebrates that they cross. Their stomachs can also expand 3 times the normal size, so it just really helps with excessive feeding. They have been located in a variety of habitats. This includes coral reefs, mangroves, seagrass, estuaries. Additionally, their sexual maturity is very quick. They become sexually mature within their first year of life. Females can produce up to 20,000 eggs every 3 to 4 days, which means within a year that can be 1.2 million eggs. Given the fact that they can live up to 15 years in the wild, that is a large amount of lionfish in a relatively short amount of time. Also, they are cryptic. They're cryptic predatory hunters. So, native fish are unsuspecting to how they hunt, and they are unaware that when the lionfish opens their mouth, there's a very rapid vacuum effect. And then lastly, there are no natural predators in this region. And because lionfish, as you can see here in this picture, they have numerous amount of spines. They have this white and red striped coloration, and that is a typical warning for other fish to stay away. So, impacts of this invasion on the regional scale, they have really reduced the marine biodiversity in a lot of areas. And a reduction of herbivorous reef fish and invertebrates that really help maintain the health of the reef will eventually create a lot of excess and overgrowth of algae, which in turn can suppress the growth of corals. And over time, that means that the health of the reef will decline, and a lot of these locations, like Belize, are very dependent on marine-related tourism. So, down the road, we can see a lot of impacts to that industry. That being said, a lot of these fish are very economically important to a lot of these countries, and so we can also see a very large decline in annual revenue, which is especially concerning for the artisanal fisher who relies very much on their day-to-day catch. And then lastly, competition with other predatory species could also exacerbate the reduction in biodiversity overall. So, with all of these characteristics that lionfish have within the marine environment, there are various strategies that have been tried to help reduce the population densities. In Belize, these strategies include bounties, tournaments, being served in restaurants. When lionfish was first discovered in Belize, a bounty was put. It was very high for each fish that was brought in, and so funding quickly ran out. Tournaments, there are a variety of tournaments that are done each year or in a variety of locations, but there's inconsistency with the amount of cullings that are done, and so it doesn't have a very large impact on the overall population density of lionfish. And through the work of Blue Ventures, they have recognized that 15 restaurants do serve lionfish regularly on their menus, but a majority of those restaurants are targeted towards tourists, and with Belize, there is an influx with the tourist season, so there is obviously not a consistent impact, again, on the densities of lionfish. So campaigning, All of these management strategies and campaigns, they come through the hard work of a lot of agencies and organizations like Blue Ventures, Oceana, Tide, the Belize Fisheries Department, who really work at hosting educational and outreach events to really engage the general public to learning more about lionfish and trying free samples. So even though education itself isn't really a management strategy, it's a very important aspect of any management strategy moving forward. So Phil's going to talk a little bit more about that on a larger scale.
What we've seen over the past 6 or 7 years is this push towards consuming lionfish throughout the Caribbean basin. And organizations such as NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Association, the United Nations Development Program, have all been pushing this pretty heavily. As innovative as an approach as this seems, it's actually not the first time that human consumption has been considered as a management strategy for an invasive fish species. So just really briefly, I'd like to give you a couple case studies, sort of put our work into context a little bit. Starting off with the Nile Perch, which was introduced into Lake Victoria in Eastern Africa from the Nile Basin, and decimated native fish stocks, contributing to the extinction of over 100 species of native cichlids, essentially decimating the ecology of this lake before being successfully exploited for human consumption markets, both locally as well as internationally. A case that might be a little more pertinent to those of us in this room is the case of the Asian Carp, which was introduced to the United States from China in the 1970s before becoming established throughout the Mississippi River Basin and the Great Lakes region. Typical invasive species outcompeting native fish for space and resources. Organizations such as Fish and Wildlife Service, as well as conservation departments and natural resource agencies in the Midwest, have considered the market potential of Asian carp in the United States. And in 2013, Varvel and Secchi did a study investigating consumer demand of Asian carp in the U.S. And despite determining that there's quite a large potential market for Asian carp, that market has, as of yet, not been established. So we have one case where you have human consumption successfully exploiting an invasive fish species, and another where it hasn't. So what are the differences there? And hopefully that'll become a little more clear through the course of our presentation today. Just to introduce a little bit of theory briefly, this really became the backbone of our study, was the Diffusion of Innovations framework, which was popularized by the economist Everett Rogers in the 1980s. Since then, it's been built upon and expanded. Essentially, the diffusion of innovation theory is the process by which an innovation is communicated through certain channels over time among members of a social system. There are four key components. You have the innovation itself, which is any product or practice which is perceived to be novel. You have communication channels within a social system, and all this is happening along a temporal axis over a period of time. So this is just a nice graphical representation of the diffusion process at the society level. One aspect of Rogers' work that was really seminal was he discerned different adopter categories through which an innovation passes on its way to achieving market saturation. So you start off with a handful of innovators, and then followed by a period of rapid exponential growth before it levels out and then collapsing on the backside as that process diffuses. So this is really what the process looks like on a societal scale. The process looks a little bit different on an individual scale, taking the form of complex decision-making processes, which Rogers termed the innovation decision process. which he says is the process through which an individual or other decision-making unit passes from first knowledge of an innovation to forming an attitude towards that innovation, to a decision to either adopt or reject, to implementation of a new idea, and eventual confirmation of this decision. So forming an attitude we have highlighted here because attitudes play an important role in this process, moving from first knowledge to making a decision to eventual confirmation, and that having a favorable attitude towards whatever this innovation may be is the necessary pre-existing condition to that decision-making process. So the goal of our study was really to understand what is the attitude of the general Belizean public towards lionfish consumption. And by gauging that attitude, we can develop an understanding of potential market demand. So we developed sort of an iterative process through the course of our research, 3 main objectives. The first of which was to understand current market penetration of lionfish according to the Diffusion of Innovation framework in Belize. Additionally, we wanted to profile different adopter groups, specifically the innovators and early adopters and the early majority groups. And lastly, we wanted to investigate the factors that contribute to favorable attitude development towards lionfish consumption. Working with Blue Ventures and this regional strategy, our project, we wanted it to be really applied research. So these 3 components taken together can really help provide an understanding of what is the market potential, as well as identifying and developing a targeted marketing strategy to hopefully increase lionfish consumption on a large scale. And Julie's going to talk to us a little bit more about just how we went about doing that.
Yes, so in order to achieve answering those objectives, and through our literature review, we didn't really find anything where social science was related to lionfish. So we sort of had to develop our own survey instrument, and after we did that, we conducted face-to-face structured surveys with iPads. So in order to figure out who we wanted to talk to, we decided we were going to talk to Belizeans, yeah. And that meant for us they had to be a resident of Belize for a year or more, and they also had to be 18 years or older. Once we knew who we were going to talk to, we had to figure out how many to talk to, and so using the Belize Statistical Institute census of 2010, and using a confidence interval of 95% and a confidence level of 5%, we determined that we needed to talk to 384 people, and so we rounded that up to an even 400. And then lastly, again, using the census, we had to determine where we were going to find these respondents. So figuring out where there were a majority of the population throughout Belize allowed us to determine to survey the 6 district capitals and then any town that had a population greater than 6,000. So our goal was to really have a representative sample of both geographic and cultural aspects of Belize. We know that Belize is very culturally diverse. They have Creoles, Mestizo, Garifuna, Mayans, East Indians, expatriates, and other people. And so making sure that all of these different ethnicities were properly represented was what we made sure we did. You can also see on this map the Kaya district was overrepresented. So again, using the census, we made sure to account for this and made sure that the districts were represented proportionally. Our overall goal was to make sure that all of our data that we were collecting was representing Belize as a whole. So we were very diligent on using the census because it was the most recent one to really infer all of our findings to the greater population. Oh, and then also we made sure that we translated our survey into Spanish, and then we had it back translated. And we hired a local student to go with us into the field in the districts that have a high percentage of Spanish speakers, because Phil and I don't speak fluent Spanish. We wanted to make sure our survey was inclusive as possible to represent the population. So now we're going to, and then once we were at these location sites, we wanted to situate ourselves in places where they have a high percentage of the local population. So these sites included marketplaces, bus terminals, water taxi ports, and parks. So getting into the actual survey, the design, we formed our questions based on awareness of just general seafood consumption, level of knowledge around lionfish, and then attitudes towards consuming lionfish. So I just lost my spots. In doing so, we also took socio-demographic information, including age, occupation, gender, wealth indicators, to really try and understand what variables are influencing the attitudes of consuming lionfish. Our final survey consisted of 31 questions. And then we piloted our survey in 2 different towns, Punta Gorda and Independence. And then at each of these sites, our sampling technique was to situate ourselves at these bus terminals or marketplaces where there was high traffic, and we randomly selected every other person that went by. At bus terminals where people tended to be a little more sedentary, we just selected one person at each bench until all the benches had been surveyed and repeated. Once we collected all of this data, we made indices. So for our knowledge index, that was comprised from our true-false questions. From our attitude and neophobia index, that was from our 5-point Likert scale. And then our wealth index, we used principal component analysis, and that means we assessed household assets to determine their economic status. Through the literature of Fillmore and Pritchett, who's done a lot of research, especially in developing countries such as Belize, assessing household assets was easier to do because it might be more difficult or sensitive to ask about just general income straight out. We did that. And then with analysis, we took all of our descriptives, we ran some chi-squares and a one-way ANOVA test to look at the variables and the relationships among them and the questions that we asked, just to see where the significances were. And then we also ran a latent class analysis, which looks at regressions and tries to determine if there's more specific variables that will relate to attitudes towards consuming lionfish. Now Phil is going to talk about our results.
All right. So what did we find out? First of all, Julie talked about how diligent we were in getting a representative sample of Belize, because that was the only way we were going to be able to draw or make inferences at the population level. So these first 2 figures, which might be a little difficult to read, just are illustrating that for you. So the table on the left shows our samples stratified by district of residence. So you can see the percent population column, which was the percent of the population according to the most recent census. And then the right-hand column was the number of completed surveys that we took from each of those districts. The figure on the right is the breakdown culturally according to the census. The middle two columns is where we want to be looking. The percent population was the percent of the population. You old guys squinting in the back. Of the population according to the most recent census. And the percent of our sample, this was actually the percent of our sample that was represented of those cultures just based on random sampling. So we're pretty confident in that our sample is representative of the overall Belizean public. So there's a preponderance of literature about the relationship between awareness of environmental problems and behavioral intention to help solve those problems. So one of the things that we were thinking about early on was gauging just awareness of lionfish in general. So we asked all of the 400 respondents, had they heard of lionfish, and 75% of our sample had, which indicates that awareness of lionfish is relatively widespread and prolific. While it doesn't necessarily say much about people's level of knowledge about the issues associated with lionfish, we can say that most people in Belize, or 3 out of 4, have at least heard of lionfish. So to revisit objective 1, which was to understand current market penetration of lionfish according to the Diffusion of Innovation framework. We determined market penetration by the percentage of seafood consumers in our sample who had consumed lionfish on at least one occasion. So we asked respondents, have you ever tried eating lionfish? And of seafood consumers, 15% reported that they had consumed lionfish at least once, which on the surface sounds like a minority, and it is. But if we revisit this graphical representation of the diffusion process, 15% of a population suggests that Belize is on or near this threshold between the innovator and early majority categories and the majority categories that come later. So you can see that's a period of rapid growth. So we can infer that among Belize possesses a critical mass of lionfish consumers that can act as key informants in the social system, increasing lionfish consumption at a larger scale. We also looked at repeated behavior as another metric for market penetration. So we asked those people who had consumed lionfish, had they eaten it more than once? And 81% said that they had. And this is a reassuring statistic, just in that showing that lionfish consumption, product confirmation rather, among lionfish consumers is relatively high, as indicated by their repeated behavior, which is what we would like to see. We also wanted to gauge an understanding of market potential of lionfish. So by asking all those respondents who reported that they hadn't consumed lionfish if they would be willing to try a free sample. And 50% of those respondents reported they would be willing to try a free sample. 36% reported that they would not be willing, and an additional 14% reported being undecided. Again, another reassuring statistic, considering 50% of your potential market would be willing to try a free sample without any additional information or knowledge provided to them. Also, this 14% can be seen as a potential opportunity in that they could be swayed into the yes category given just a little bit of information or something as simple as just presentation of the sample. Once they're actually there in the moment and have it in front of them, looks pretty good. Might as well. So we also looked at engaging market potential, the reasons why people reported having not tried lionfish. And by far the most common response, by 48% of respondents, was that it's just not available. It's not here. So when we compare that to the percentage of people who said they'd be willing to try lionfish, it's almost identical. So this could lead us to believe that given just if lionfish was just made available, you could increase the market by an additional 41.8%, which pushes through the early majority and into the late majority. So understanding who these people are who fall into either of these categories really became central to our analysis moving forward. If this is your potential market, who are these people and where do they come from? Which was our second objective, to profile the innovators, early adopters, as well as those early majority populations. That's not right. So as Julie mentioned, we ran a suite of statistical tests, including chi-square test of independence and one-way ANOVAs, in order to discern any meaningful and significant differences between groups and in relation to lionfish consumption. So for those people who reported having tried lionfish, we did find 4 things that stood out. This might be difficult to read again in the back. We found a statistical difference between those who fell into the high knowledge category and the low knowledge category. So 21.7% of respondents who fell into our high knowledge category had tried lionfish, whereas only 1.1% of the individuals in the low knowledge had tried lionfish. We also found a significant difference between males and females, with 18.6% of the males in our survey having tried lionfish and only 9.9% females. District of residence was significant between coastal and inland areas. 20.3% of coastal respondents had tried lionfish, only 4.2% of inland residents. And also occupation played into this, whether your livelihood was associated with the fishing, tourism, or restaurant industries, or if it was an unrelated industry. So if we were going to create an innovator profile for lionfish in Belize, we're likely looking at coastal dwelling males with a high level of knowledge whose livelihood is in some way associated with fishing, tourism, or the restaurant industries. So we repeated the process with those who reported being willing to try a free sample and found a similar pattern. Level of knowledge, again, a significant factor. 59.1% of individuals who fell into the high knowledge category would be willing to try versus 36.3% of the low. And there was this difference between males and females. Once again, males were more likely to be willing to try lionfish. And we also found a statistical difference in different age groups, with the mean age for those who were willing to try being 37 years old, and the mean age for those who were not willing to try being 33 years old, which it doesn't sound like that much, but most of the literature on this talks about innovators and sort of the early adopter classes being sort of the younger generations. Just something to think about. So early majority profile, we're looking at lower middle-aged males with high knowledge who seem to be less restricted by their location or their livelihood, which is what you would expect as you move to a more majority cross-section of the population. You would have less of these distinct factors that were contributing to that. Objective 3 was to investigate the factors that contribute to favorable attitude development towards lionfish consumption. And we kind of went down the rabbit hole on this one. Initially, we wanted to run a multiple regression, looking at the relationships between various indicators and lionfish consumption. And that didn't really lead us, we weren't explaining a whole lot of the variation in our data doing that. So we ended up in this sort of more exploratory realm of latent class analysis, which is a statistical procedure allowing for the identification of unmeasured or latent groups within a data set using your observed characteristics. A lot of times in social science, it happens in ecological sciences as well. You have your study and you're measuring certain measurable items, which when taken together aren't telling the whole story. You have different groups falling in there as well. So latent class analysis is a way to kind of tease out some of those differences. Looking at complex patterns of association between different variables, and basically tells us who's similar based on a set of observed characteristics. We wanted to understand attitudes. This is the output from our aggregated attitude index. You can see along the x-axis, we have favorability towards lionfish. So the higher the value, the more favorable the attitude, and the number of respondents. I'm not going to go too far into the weeds on exactly how this model works. If anyone wants to talk more later about that, I'd be happy to do so. But we used that attitude favorability index as our dependent variable, and we took the level of knowledge index as gauged by the 7 true-false questions about lionfish. And then this index we developed around food neophobia, so the aversion to trying new foods, as our 2 main predictor variables. Not having a whole lot of theory to sort of base a lot of this on, we lumped in all these socio-demographic variables as covariates as well, just based on the idea if we want to profile these people, it'd be nice to know who they are, right? So the outputs, which are going to be hard to read in the back. Basically, what latent class analysis allows you to do is look at splitting each of your variables into different groups based on similar patterns. You can split it into 2, or you can split it into 7. It's a matter of you want to find the model that's best explaining the most variation in your data according to various sample size limitations. So we ended up using a 2-class solution based on the fact that by adding a second class, we were explaining significantly more of the variation in our data than just using a single class solution. So overall, this model accounted for 54% of the variability in our data set, which we're actually quite happy with, based on not having any theory to kind of gauge this on to begin with. So looking at the 2 regimes, we see there's positive and negative values. The positive numbers would be positively associated with favorable attitude development. The negative values are negatively associated. And the bold and asterisk values were significant relationships, and that's key. So just looking at this right off the bat, we can see that all of our socio-demographic variables weren't bearing a significant weight on someone's attitude towards lionfish consumption, except for at the bottom, district of residence. So for class 1, we found a significant and positive relationship with coastal residents and a significant and positive relationship with the level of knowledge. So indicating that for, a decent percentage of the people in our study, level of knowledge is really driving the favorability of their attitude towards lionfish consumption. Conversely, if we look at class 2 or regime 2, we see a significant positive relationship with inland residents and a significant positive relationship with this neophobia index. And level of knowledge really isn't playing much of a factor at all. So which leads us to believe that there's another group of people who are more inclined to try or less averse to trying new products. So it's less about how much I know about this thing, it's more a propensity to innovate or try new things that's really driving that attitude, which is an interesting finding given that all of our other inferential statistical tests really show that level of knowledge to be high up there, saying that it might not be a limiting factor in all the cases. A few other considerations that weren't directly related to our research objectives, but emerged through our data that we thought were pertinent to discuss. First of those is willingness to pay. So another way to gauge market potential, and probably a more robust way, is to investigate consumer willingness to pay for a product. Because if you're going to have a market, eventually you need people to, not just going to be free samples all the time, they're going to have to pay for it. So we asked individuals who reported having consumed lionfish how much they'd be willing to pay for lionfish in various common preparations. And as you can see, the average price reported by respondents for a pound of lionfish fillet from the market was 9 Belizean dollars. Previous research done by Blue Ventures and others investigating how much lionfish was being bought by restaurants indicated 10 Belize dollars. So it's pretty close, but it does indicate that there might be somewhat of a discrepancy between what consumers are willing to pay for the product and its actual market price at this point in time. So compounding this issue of willingness to pay is market competition with more familiar and preferred fish meats. We asked all the seafood consumers in our survey, what type of fish do you eat the most? And 67% reported that red snapper was their preferred fish meat, which becomes even more profound when we look at the second most common response. Was only 3.5% of the population was this yellowfin mohara, locally known as chiwa. So this widespread, prolific preference for snapper could be a potential barrier for any potential lionfish market to become established. Specifically, when we look at the mean price of snapper is about half that of lionfish. We were also looking at the reasons why people had an aversion to try lionfish. So we asked, why wouldn't you be willing to try a free sample? To those who said they wouldn't be willing to try a free sample of lionfish. And also, why haven't you tried? And it's dangerous came up frequently. And thinking about this, lionfish, they are dangerous if you get stung by one, but to consume them, they're perfectly fine. So in thinking about gaining market share of lionfish, alleviating some of these common misperceptions seems like it would be the right way to go. So we looked at some of the true-false questions from our level of knowledge section of the survey to see which ones were answered incorrectly the most often. 46.7% were either unsure, thought lionfish wasn't safe to eat. 40.7% of people thought people had died from lionfish stings. So some of these, and 31% of individuals weren't sure. So clearing up some of these common misperceptions could be another way to bring some of these potential non-consumers over into the lionfish market. So what does it all mean? So we've demonstrated that Belize possesses potentially a critical mass of lionfish consumers who can act as key informants in increasing lionfish consumption nationally. We've also determined that there's a potential market in those willing to try lionfish. Given no additional information or persuasion, just by creating access, making it available to them, which seems like quite a large opportunity. This kind of falls a little bit outside of our research, but there's plenty of literature suggesting that economic factors influence consumer behavior and purchasing decisions. And these economic barriers surrounding willingness to pay and competitive price seem to be major barriers to the potential lionfish market. Additionally, this lack of access is a major inhibitor to market growth in reaching the potential market. We've also demonstrated that knowledge is key, at least in the early phases of market penetration. Knowledge is associated with lionfish consumption as a behavior, willingness to try, as well as favorable attitude development. Additionally, misinformation around the safety of lionfish appears to be a barrier and something that could potentially easily be corrected given a little bit of information. Diffusion as a process moves from high densities to low densities. So we determined, it makes sense that those who are proximal to the lionfish as an issue in terms of location or occupation have high knowledge and are likely form the backbone of our innovators and early adopters. As we talked about a little bit before, as you move through that diffusion process, that early majority is probably less restricted by location, knowledge, and livelihood. Additionally, inland areas seem to present a huge opportunity that may not necessarily be dependent on their level of knowledge as a limiting factor, at least in terms of favorable attitude development towards lionfish consumption.
So, going through all those results and figuring out what it all means, we do have a few recommendations for Blue Ventures in moving forward with their marketing campaign and this overall regional strategy. And pretty much start with the low-lying fruit first. So like the first page, Blue Ventures primarily works in the coastal districts already. So continue working there, really developing more of the level of knowledge to address a lot of those misconceptions towards handling and the fact that there's safety concerns and they think it's dangerous. Working through more outreach events and education events, and taster booths. They can really help build, the individuals that are closest to lionfish and have easier access. And even potentially maybe establishing more handling demonstrations might really help reduce a lot of those barriers and misconceptions as well. And hopefully that will really encourage a lot of those coastal residents to start consuming more lionfish. A second phase, as Phil had talked about, those inland residents, knowledge doesn't seem to be as much of a factor in their attitudes toward consuming lionfish. So our recommendation to Blue Ventures would be maybe to shift their strategy and maybe focus more on cuisine or cultural aspects around food to try to encourage them, because there seems to be a more willingness, as we looked at the latent class analysis, that there's more incentive just by curiosity and just to try new and different foods. And then, trying to just develop more, as Phil had mentioned, the male population tends to be larger consumers of lionfish, so trying to develop that but also trying to focus more on the female population, and that might be through, jewelry of lionfish, or, maybe there's a way to incorporate, educational things at the school level where there has to be some kind of incorporation at home, and then information is brought back to school, so kids can engage parents. That might be one way. And I'm sure, we'd like to sit down and talk about more ways, but these are the ones that we thought of initially. Some next steps, really trying to incorporate the targeted audiences that our research found into their marketing campaign will hopefully encourage more of the lionfish consumption, but on a regional scale to really be able to understand and fully develop a management plan. Interviewing fishermen is going to be key. It wasn't part of our assessment or our project, but really understanding what the price point and those economic barriers Phil talked about earlier, and establishing the supply and demand is really key. Also looking at the tourist sector and really understanding, the influence that they have on the market, even though it is a little more in flux with the season and variability, they still have a presence, and establishing what their willingness to pay versus the local Belizean, that's important information that will help with the campaign. And also collaborating, because this is a regional scale issue, just the continuation of the collaboration between all the agencies is just going to be the most effective, especially in terms of monitoring reef density populations of lionfish, and still the social aspect. Future implications. So we're really hoping that our survey can be used as a blueprint throughout the entire region. This is a regional scale problem. A lot of other countries and small island nations are either in the process of developing their own management strategy or will need to in the future, and to have something that they can turn to and sort of gauge how they're going to address their management. We hope that this can be very helpful. And again, because it's regional, hopefully to allow for more collaboration so that the whole region can really help minimize the negative impacts that lionfish can have. Very lastly, big thanks to Jen Chapman and Mark Frutima at Blue Ventures for their assistance since before we got down to Belize, but in Belize, providing us with information and background and just assistance when we needed it. Luis Pena, he was our research field assistant that went in the field with us and helped with Spanish translation. Kelly Martin and Tara Teal, our committee members that really helped us with analysis and provided a great amount of assistance throughout the process of figuring out what our results meant. And obviously, Jen Solomon, our advisor, who has been very supportive the entire process. Thank you very much. Really appreciate it.
So we'll take questions from the audience. Yeah.
So the statistical analysis and everything was really rigorous, and the representative sample looks like you guys put a lot of effort into that method. Just curious if you had any thoughts on potential limitations of the project, or is there anything we've done differently?
I've got something.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think we really wanted to develop a context for the lionfish market, so we weren't screening respondents based on do you consume seafood. We ended up 15% of the seafood consumers of our sample, it was like 42. So we couldn't do much in terms of, that's not a large enough sample to really do any sort of rigorous analysis to really find out, modeling who these innovators are. So I think, if we had unlimited time and money, it might be nice to go back and talk to 400 people who eat lionfish, and really develop a robust understanding of that.
To supplement that, part of what we were looking at initially, as we had talked about, was geographic and cultural. And again, because of our sample size, it turns out we couldn't provide a whole lot of information on the cultural aspect, because once broken down into all those various groups, we didn't have enough numbers to generate any statistical differences. So yeah, going back, if we just had more time and could talk to more people, I think that might provide some more additional information.
I had a question, and kind of brought it up in your next step slide, concerning fishermen.
Mm-hmm.
I was just wondering if through your research you encountered anything, like is there infrastructure in place to catch and serve lionfish, and does that have other, like do they do like seining or gill netting, and does it have other negative impacts separately, just the process of fishing?
Yeah, so lionfish, for the most part, can only be fished by spearing it.
Okay.
So it doesn't have pretty much other negative impacts. Pretty much the barrier is, the limiting barrier is those willing to go out and actually spear them. So, having the appropriate equipment to be able to actually spear them, knowing how to handle them, so there's a level of knowledge and just general comfort with the lionfish. So there's no established, there's nothing really established. It's on a personal, individual basis if fishermen want to go out and catch it or not at this point.
I had a question for you both, Julie and Phil. This is Jen.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Okay. So my question really was, because you mentioned, and it's very clear that the barrier of accessibility is really what's preventing our movement into the early majority category. However, of course, the barrier isn't how many lionfish there are out there, it is how much people are willing to pay. So I wonder if it's possible to look more closely at that sample of people who said yes, the 41.8% who would be willing to have lionfish but state that their only barrier is accessibility, and break that down and see which of that group have got a sufficiently high willingness to pay, and really explore these kind of questions surrounding willingness to pay further.
Yeah, Jen, so we actually ended up, the willingness to pay was only conducted, that section of the survey was only conducted with those who had tried lionfish, because they had existing knowledge of, okay, I've tried this, I can compare it to other things, and therefore give you an accurate willingness of a price point. I think that's definite need. Yeah, I think it's difficult. It might be difficult for those who haven't tried the product to be able to give a reliable, or be able to provide reliable information on what they would be willing to pay. But I think that's what we were thinking about designing the survey. But it's definitely an area that should be looked at.
Cool. So basically then sort of like a big next question would be determining how we can assess willingness to pay amongst the early majority that has been identified through your study to better understand our target audience.
Absolutely, yeah.
Is that cool? Thank you. I'll turn my audio off again.
Thanks, Jen. You have something?
Yeah, it's kind of a two-part question, but so the first part, what you learned about people you surveyed, is that translatable to other regions, like not coastal, like not islands, like the United States or Mexico or something, other parts of other types of regions?
So, say around the Caribbean or just anywhere?
I'm thinking about the United States, maybe, but like,
Okay.
because what you learned from like the demographics, is that translatable to a totally different region?
Certain aspects I think would, but trying to compare a developing country to a country like the United States, there's definitely aspects that would be changed in the survey, especially when it comes to trying to determine wealth, because that's a huge factor in being willing to purchase. And the culture aspect too. In Belize, culture heavily influences what people eat. And I don't know if that's the same for the United States. So there are aspects of our survey I think that are translatable and could be used elsewhere in any region, but certain aspects of it are specifically directed at Belize.
Yeah, I think we were thinking about it. If you were going to apply it elsewhere, it'd have to be adapted. It's most applicable throughout the Caribbean Basin and Central America, but it would still probably need to be tweaked if you were doing it in, Dominica or Jamaica, or especially in the United States, it would look a little bit different. Yeah.
And then sort of related, so you found that sort of the touristy restaurants are kind of what sold this. So I mean, targeting those markets where people came from those, or wherever they came from, targeting like the United States are a pretty decent sized coastal region. People have a little more money, and then if you, is exporting an option for exporting lionfish an option?
It's really beyond the scope of what we were looking at, but yes, it is an option, and it has been looked at.
Yeah, it has
exporting lionfish.
Been looked at, and part of it has to do with funding, and so if funders or those on the receiving end back out for whatever reason, now Belize has this lionfish that maybe doesn't want to be consumed by the local market, or so what are they going to do with that?
There's issues too, like exporting to the United States with the U.S. Department of Agriculture and regulations that they have. Ciguatera, which is a shellfish toxin, which is prevalent throughout some of the Caribbean region, is a concern. And I think, is it the FDA, right? The Food and Drug Administration has listed lionfish as a high Ciguatera threat. Ciguatera is not even present in Belize, so you have some of these sort of like regulatory barriers that exist there too, but there have been limited exports. Yeah.
And also just like establishing an infrastructure to be able to process it within Belize to be able to export, that still needs to be developed a little more fully.
I just wanted to say, if anyone's interested, we have a lot of information about export. So anyone who wants to contact me, I can answer those questions as well.
Thanks, Dan.
What are you doing now and does it relate to this study?
So I am actually flying back to Belize tomorrow, and with the next steps, I will be interviewing those fishermen to really figure out what are the barriers and what are the price points that they're willing to start catching lionfish. And I believe I might be doing the tourist surveys as well. Yeah, so I'm definitely doing this tourist survey. So that way we can really understand the bigger picture of the supply and demand side. Phil and I just sort of looked at the local demand side, but understanding, the international tourist market, and then, the willingness of the fishermen establishing what those barriers are to be able to address that, so that way for the marketing we can make sure there's a flow from the sea to the plate.
Good.
Hey, Julie, Phil, I've just got a quick question.
Yeah,
Okay.
go ahead, Mark.
Hey, so you mentioned that for the inland populations, you guys recommended sort of marketing lionfish more alongside cultural values and local cuisine. And I was just curious as to how you got to that, whether there were specific questions you were asking or that was based on personal observations and sort of discussions that you had along during your field work.
Yeah, so Mark, when we were looking at you might have to flip back a couple slides if you want to look at it, but that latent class analysis that we performed used that aversion to new foods index, that neophobia index, as one of our predictor variables, which came up significantly. There was a significant positive relationship with inland residents, and that it was more an affinity towards trying new and different things that was driving their favorable attitude development towards lionfish consumption. So level of knowledge was not as important seemingly there, and that's how we came to that recommendation and those conclusions.
Yeah, I think cuisine itself and trying to see if the cultural aspects, that was something that was just more of our personal discussions, and we were trying to think of ways besides the knowledge that could maybe incentivize that group to try lionfish more.
We can talk more about that too. Flesh that out a little bit.
Who this research is conducted? Who was the partner or investor for this research?
Who was like the financial provider?
Or what is the target of the research? Is that just academic or finding some answer for some question? Or there is a business behind and there is some investor? Or according to our reason, the question can be different, asked differently. Focus on the research or focus on the target or?
It was actually, I think, a combination of all three. I mean, so for Phil and I, it was so we could get our masters. But for the for the college, we're trying to publish a paper on this, so we can provide a more scientific backing for what we did. But then I think this really provides Blue Ventures with moving forward for trying to establish this management strategy and to focus their marketing campaign to where it's going to be most beneficial with the limited resources that they have. So I think it's just a combination of all, we're all benefiting from it.
So Blue Venture is the investor for this research, basically.
Yeah, we helped develop these research questions with them in mind and what they want to do. And yeah, that was our main focus, was how can we best contribute to this regional lionfish exploitation strategy. So yeah, this is leaving our hands and going to these people, Jen and Mark, that are working on the ground. They're working on this stuff all day, literally all day, every day.
Literally.
Did you find that since it's a regional issue that there's other people doing targeting the consumption of lionfish that you could further collaborate with?
Yeah, there's been a small number of people that are starting to look at the social side of it, to see the willingness of people to start consuming. And like Phil said, it's not like a new idea. People are consuming it, but I don't think anybody on this large scale has really tried to assess it. It's just small pocketed areas, very small and localized for the most part. So Hopefully.
We did have University of Florida and Emory approached, a bit at a conference where they wanted to do something similar. They are doing something, and I think it's in the British Virgin Islands. So there should be some comparative research throughout the region, hopefully.
And did you all exchange your survey instruments? I mean,
We can talk about that later.
Yeah.
We haven't yet. Yeah.
There was some, how funding and, we gave them the general sort of template of what we did, and they were going to develop their own survey.
So I was really interested in the willingness to pay and the red snapper comparison. 67% is a ridiculous number. So have you guys talked with Blue Ventures much or thought yourselves about this idea of maybe trying to not compete with red snapper as like the rice and beans of the Belizean diet, but more like marketing lionfish as this exotic luxury good that is you want to pay more for it rather than trying to get the price down?
Yeah, wanting and actually doing are two different things in Belize. And I think a lot of people would want to, but just may not have the ability to pay for a luxury item. And so overall, that wouldn't really impact the consumption rate, and therefore wouldn't be fished as much.
I think if you look at lion, this was really, there's other, not research, but people have been looking at lionfish as sort of exotic, luxury good. You have most of the people that are eating it in Belize, I would imagine, this is my own imagining, are tourists from the United States or Europe that are eating it there. So I do think that there is a potential viable market there, but really beyond the scope of our study and looking just at the local Belizeans. I don't know what the demand among local Belizeans would be for a high-priced exotic fish. And
a lot of, just a quick note, and then we'll get to you. A lot of untraditional foods in Belize are exported, like sea cucumber and alligator and those kind of things. So a lot of local Belizeans aren't really interested in that exotic kind of food item at the moment, it seems like.
Off that question, so I was just thinking about the supply of red snapper versus lionfish. How is the populations different, or the sizes different? And then is there any sort of way that they can get more return for fishermen? Because if they're individually spraying those fish, then that returns can be less. Is there some way they can, fish those in mass where they could get more return, and that would drive the price down?
There's been this emphasis in adding value to lionfish catches. So the jewelry is one example of that. Previously discarded parts, using them to make jewelry adds to the overall value of taking a lionfish out of the water. If you can sell the meat for food, and then you can sell the fins and the spines for jewelry, it makes it a little more economically viable. So looking at some of those, adding value to the product have been considered. And as Julie mentioned, it's really broadly dispersed through wide ranges of the water column in sometimes moderate densities, but really sort of it's difficult to catch. Yeah,
that's just mine. I just don't know about the lionfish, but
it's a good question.
Yeah, thanks.
Well, I think that concludes the public questions.
Thanks,
check
Jen
it out.
and Mark.